So shame and a certain kind of shamelessness are two feelings consistently woven through the work of William Young. I contend, I should add, this is the idea that I'm going to explore in this webinar. So if you've seen the exhibition, Seeing and Being Seen, you might not notice these feelings first of all. What we see in the first instance is the clear celebration of friendship, family, and community. These negative feelings, nonetheless, are a key feature, I think, of his oeuvre, perhaps like an undertow giving his work an affective or emotional complexity. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start by explaining these two terms, shame and shamelessness. Now, shame is a slippery emotion that more often than not operates as a break rather than something we feel directly. Psychoanalyst Leon Wormser explains this mechanism. He argues that shame has three main meanings. Shame as anticipatory anxiety about potential humiliation. Shame as preventative, a dispositional orientation to the world that seeks to avoid disgrace. And then finally, the actual experience of shame, the real or imagined feeling of being exposed or looked at with disapprobation by others. So the fact that Wormser lists not one but two meanings whose sole function is to avoid being ashamed speaks to how little we want to experience it directly. The experience of shame, as psychologists and cultural theorists repeatedly remind us, is deeply disturbing and disorganizing. For example, American psychologist Sylvan Tonkin states that of all the negative feelings or negative affects, as the psychologists tend to call this phenomenon, he says shame strikes deepest into the heart of man. According to him, it's felt as an inner torment, a sickness of the soul. For queer theorist Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, and she's a key interpreter of Tonkin's, pain and volatility are the leitmotifs of shame. Shame causes a double movement, which she describes as proceeding in seemingly contradictory directions. I'm quoting her here, towards painful individuation, towards uncontrollable relationality. So in other words, a kind of self-consciousness, a separation from others, is coupled with the feeling of being exposed to the disapproving gaze of potentially countless others. So put simply, the painful inward turn is also a turn outward. But it is this outward turn, if it's uncontrollable, that results in a difficulty to determine or limit just whose regard might cause shame. In Sedgwick's view, this lack of limits means that shame is both contagious and potentially paralyzing. So that's actually her phrases. So this strange reliance in both Tonkins and Sedgwick on metaphors of disease and infirmity, so sickness, contagion, to describe what they both regard as an innate part of human psychic structure, underscores the magnitude of the aversion to shame. Shame socializes, first and foremost, it seems, by preventing behavior, hence that metaphor I had of the break, that two of these definitions are about sort of stopping us even feeling it. So turning to the other term of my title, shamelessness, it should simply mean the absence of shame. Showing a lack of shame, according to the dictionary, is seemingly a negative thing. Strangely, it has a negative rather than a neutral meaning. Shameless implies that shame should be felt and that the person displaying this quality is too bold or outrageous. In English, there is then not a neutral way of describing the absence or, more importantly, the reworking of shame. Yet in Young's oeuvre, a transformation of shame is clearly at work, both in relation to his Chinese identity and his portraits of the LGBTIQ community. More on this shortly. First, let me indicate some of the ways to understand his practice more broadly. So Young's photographs draw comparisons with that of American artist Nan Goldin, whose work I'm hoping you might be familiar with. Goldin and Young both use photography in a diaristic, highly personal manner, and both have documented the LGBTIQ community. And there are various scenes in New York in the case of Goldin and Sydney in the case of William Young. They both also documented the AIDS crisis, thinking of one of Nan Goldin's works, got showed Kissing Giles from 1993. Similarly, just to give you another instance of the work of the 90s, which was focusing on the AIDS crisis, this is the work of Felix Gonzalez Torres. So you can see how that's a much more personal, diaristic, documentary mode of looking at the AIDS crisis. Similarly, here's the incredibly moving series from William Young, Alan from the Sadness series. These diaristic and personal approaches contrast with this more conceptual representation of AIDS. In this instance, it's Portrait of Ross, who was the lover of Gonzalez Torres. And this is his ideal weight. It's an interactive work where you take one of the lollies and you contribute to the wasting of that weight, that body. So much more metaphorical in the way it was dealing with AIDS. This work I show my students every year. I think it's an incredibly important work from the 90s dealing with the AIDS crisis. It's if you haven't been to see the show yet, definitely recommend you go and see this. So both Young and Goldin included themselves in these diaristic ways of looking at the community. So it's not a voyeuristic version of documentary. They are participant observers, to use that anthropological term. There's another work by Nan Goldin. You can see that that's her on the bed there, the Ballad of Sexual Dependence. So it's quite, she exposes herself in a similarly kind of, I guess, forensic manner to the way in which she documented the lives of others. So moving back to Young, one of the key differences is this unique combination of photography and written passages, which he inscribes directly onto the images. The text enables the nuances of his personal life, his feelings, thoughts, and observations, as well as his social context to be clearly communicated. And you can see the text is endearing and conversational. I read out to you what it says. So it has, the title of this work is William in Scholar's Costume, and the humorous explanatory text arches over this gloriously ornate orange scholar headdress. And he writes, I learned Taoism, a Chinese philosophy, and this led to me embracing my Chinese heritage, which hitherto had been denied and unacknowledged. People at the time called me born-again Chinese, and that's not a bad description, as there was a certain zealousness to the process. But now I see it as a liberation from racial suppression and prefer to say I came out as a Chinese, end quote. So it's a very endearingly self-deprecating account. The wry commentary about the embrace of Chinese identity might distract, though, from the registration of shame, along with its evident overcoming. The suppression of identity, whether racial, ethnic, religious, or sexual, is a shame response. In my own family history, just like Young's, there are also efforts to suppress ethnicity. My grandparents hid my Polish Jewish heritage, while their somewhat ludicrous choice of a family surname allowed me to pass in post-war society. So acts of concealment and attempts to minimize differences are extremely common migrant experiences. And here, obviously, this is presented in this incredibly funny way. So humor is definitely one of the strategies that is used to counteract the effects of shame. In the series, My Uncle's Murder from 2008, oops, I seem to have missed that one. Where have I put it? There it is. Young speculates about how the murder of his uncle, William Fung Nguyen, in Marulian in North Queensland may have contributed to the repression of identity in his family. So below an image of his mother's signed testimony from the murder trial, he writes, and I'm quoting from his, the writing below, "My mother gave evidence at the trial and it shocked me to see my mother's signature on the transcript because she'd never told me. I think this event was very traumatic for my mother and she put it out of her mind completely. She literally blotted it out. I feel the legacy of this murder came down to me in that while I was growing up, my ethnicity was suppressed," end quote. Although Young doesn't use the word shame here, it is this affect that best accounts for the wholesale sense of wrongness about the self, which produces these kinds of evasions. The way in which shame colours self-perception is best explained through a comparison with guilt. Guilt is triggered by something we have actually done, whereas shame is more self-reflexive. We feel bad about ourselves or our ethnicity, sexual orientation, or country of origin. Guilt, on the other hand, doesn't necessarily rebound on the sense of self as a whole. It's more piecemeal in character, limited to specific acts or omissions. Such limits do not operate with shame. Hence that comment I read earlier from the American psychologist Sylvan Tompkins about shame being the negative emotion that strikes deepest into the heart of man. Usually, we break contact when we're ashamed. We literally or metaphorically look down, blush, or flush with shame. And obviously, there are also defenses to shame, like anger. But if you feel shame, there is this idea that your interest in others, your contact with others is broken off, and hence that idea of sort of the demeanor of downcast eyes. You're breaking away from sociality. You're feeling, thrown back on yourself in torment, to use the quote I cited earlier. So note that these descriptions of shame revolve around visibility. So looking down, not seeing, feeling excruciatingly visible, that sort of self-consciousness that's described as part of the experience of shame, and being the subject of a disapproving gaze, that idea that the gaze from outside is disapproving. It's criticizing, there's a sense of wanting to escape that gaze. How apt then to use sight and the celebration of visibility to overturn self-consciousness and embarrassment about identity. And in many of Yang's self-portraits, there is the quiet assertion of confidence in his Chinese identity. For example, in the text of Climbing Huang Shan, which is there, from 2005. So what have I done there? Here, just there is he despite again this very endearing, self-deprecating humour, Young nonetheless acknowledges his identification with being Chinese, and he writes, and this is along the top here, there's a saying that every Chinese should climb Huang Shan, the Yellow Mountain, before they die. Although I carry on about China being impenetrable to me, I guess I identified strongly enough with being Chinese to go on a pilgrimage to China in 2005 to climb some of the sacred mountains, among them Huangshan. So end of the quote. So in this image, Yang locates himself in the midst of a misty landscape, integrated like a large inky mountain or outcrop, yet he also seems superimposed, floating on the top of the mountains. So it's a rather fitting spatial ambiguity given his necessarily hybrid Australian-Chinese identity. This disjuncture between body and environment recurs in other self-portraits. So even his photograph, William in scholar's costume, has a slightly awkward, off-centered manner, despite the seemingly celebratory tone. Note here how the figure is both, like the pose has this extraordinary symmetry, and look at the way the sleeves come down in these very symmetrical triangles, the way the tassels from the top of the headdress join with the gown. So you have this incredibly symmetrical, carefully posed photograph, and yet the writing is sort of deliberately, it's got a daggy quality, to use a very Australian phrase. It's not beautiful script. It's again got this, rather like the actual content is conversational, the transcription is just sort of normally neat handwriting, but not overly composed. So while the figure is composed, the writing is not. And his slight off-centeredness, the fact that we can't locate him, this is a white field, there's a shadow, but it's quite fuzzy. So there's a sense of a tension between the precision of the pose and the informality of the writing. And there's often, I think, these very interesting tensions between the way the text operates and the way the image operates. It's interesting, though, that this tension between body and background does not seem to be present in the artist's photographs of others. So his images of the male body in particular suggest a loving queer eye, rather than the internalized eye of the homophobe. Pride, in other words, successfully displaces shame. Now, Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, who I've been sort of threading through this talk, saw shame as damaging, but also capable of being pressed into the service of transformation. As she once proposed, and I'm quoting here, I suggest that to view performativity in terms of habitual shame and its transformation opens a lot of new doors for thinking about identity politics, end quote. So to explain her term performativity, it's most famously applied to the question of gender by the philosopher Judith Butler in her book titled Gender Trouble from 1990. And it's interesting how these works that we're looking at, as well as this theory, are both from the early 90s. She uses the focus on performativity to shift attention from the person or the doer across to the deed. As she puts it, there need not be a doer behind the deed. The doer is variably constructed in and through the deed, she says. So as a theoretical concept, performativity's greatest purchase is perhaps in queer theory, where it functions to emphasize sexual practices rather than embodiment. So within that context, the political efficacy, goodness, I always trip on that word, of emphasizing action makes perfect sense. It highlights the contribution of sexual practices to ideas about identity. When it's used in art history, it's often used, obviously, to look at performance art, but clearly it also operates in the context of photography and all sorts of other practices. So Sedgwick takes up performativity in relation to this idea of transforming identity. So sometimes the shorthand for this is to repeat something unfaithfully. So you repeat but change the way in which a certain narrative has been constructed. So that it's the unfaithful repetition, I guess, of oppressive narratives. And here she sees this as a way to rethink identity politics. Now, identity politics art, I'll just briefly say for those of you who might be unfamiliar with it, has tended to operate using two strategies. One is what cultural theorist Shan Nai has called the uplift aesthetic of affirming or amplifying positive identities. So think back to things like Black is Beautiful or deliberate ways in which previously oppressed identities assert a positive representation of self. Alternatively, identity politics art often disputes historical constructions of race, gender, or ethnicity, sometimes with anger as the igniting or underpinning emotion. And I should have put in a slide of someone like Barbara Kruger, her kind of slogan-esque things, our body is a battleground, or your gaze hits the side of my face, those kinds of pushing sort of artworks that push away or underscore the way in which oppression has operated in terms of the objectification of women's bodies. So shame in these two strategies, the uplift aesthetic or the sort of angry, no, we're not that, shame tends to be resisted. Yet this habitual shame is an issue for identity politics and for art and literature, because oppressed minorities must navigate damaging identities that have been forged by others or forced upon them by others. So to transform this feeling then has a particular urgency. Sedgwick does not spell out a general strategy for transforming shame. Her close reading of American novelist Henry James, which is what occasions the analysis of shame. She traces the homoerotic imagery of his work as simultaneously blushing but also revealing. And in particular, she focuses on the way in which sources of shame in the writer's past were reworked rather than repudiated. So particularly when James edited the New York edition of his collected fiction. So in other words, like Young, James revisited past experiences of shame and presented them in ways that integrated those experiences, making them performatively productive, to use Sedgwick's terms. So obviously you can see that in the way Chineseness is dealt with in these self-portraits. While Young often uses humour in this transformative fashion, in James's case, what had once been tainted by the flush of shame was now presented, according to Sedgwick, with an affecting and eroticized form. So interestingly, different ways of taking the sting out of shame, if you like. Humour definitely operates very strongly in these kinds of images. Sedgwick saying James eroticizes what was once blush making. So in the complex placement of text in Young's photographs of men, there's a similar affecting and eroticized form of display. Sometimes the text snakes along the contours of the body, like a caress. And this work, Darren and Linden, Part 3 from 1991, is a very good example of that. So it's two extraordinarily beautiful young men, and think of the way your eye is led across what's often referred to in classical art theory as the sort of serpentine shape of the body. More often that serpentine line is applied to female nudes. Here it's applied, your eye is led across the curves of these young men's bodies. And the text reads as follows. They showed me a Herb Ritz photo that they liked. the two men in it were in a stylized pose and they were naked. Could I do for them something like that? I explained I couldn't reproduce the pose as that would be too difficult. Moreover, it was imitation. But I got the idea of what they wanted. They wanted sexy shots, but they wanted them artistic. Definitely nothing pornographic. You see, they were madly in love, and that's the end of that text. So it's an incredibly interesting way in which you read by following their bodies. So you're pulled into the story of their romance via this use of a snaking serpentine text. It's an incredibly interesting technique. And as we'll see in some of the other examples, he uses text very differently across different works. Other times, the text covers the whole expanse of an exposed back, like the story of the Seduction of Joe from 1979. And this is, again, this picture of this incredibly beautiful young man whose back has now become the support for this account of their sexual encounter. So I'll just read you the story. Again, they really pull you into, they give you another way of thinking about the image, and just using the way this one fits so neatly inside the back is incredibly, just draws attention to the contours of this young man's body. The story starts, we had strong eye contact right from the start, and I thought I had a good chance. The music was loud, so I leaned over to shout my opening line. He pointed to his ears and he shook his head, and I understood that he was deaf. He wrote words with his finger on the palm of his hand, J-O-E. Joe, it was totally vivid. I'll never forget it. Then he bought me a drink. We didn't have small talk, so things developed really fast. I made the shape of a house with my hands, the walls, a hip roof, and I pointed to myself. Did he want to come home with me? He agreed, and we embraced rather awkwardly, just to confirm that our intentions were similar. The ride home in the taxi was silent, no need to talk. It was perfect. Later, I found out he was a labourer from a nearby country town. He sometimes came to the city where he had friends. He was a bit shy in bed, but I liked him. I took his photo in the morning. He couldn't hear the click. It was like photographing a stone. After breakfast, I put him in a taxi. I worried how he would tell the driver where he wanted to go, but I guess that was something he'd solved before. So see how you get pulled so strongly into the narrative, so that post first sex experience and the seduction, the whole stage of this, to the point where the photograph is taken, where the young man is asleep with this sort of beautiful tousled hair, echoed by the tousled sheet at the other end. I guess that's another thing to draw attention to vis-a-vis Nan Goldin, who often is the person that William Young is compared to. Her works don't tend to be so composed. There's what I guess you would describe hers as a snapshot aesthetic. And certainly there are, in the exhibition, you'll see there's a lot of work, of photographs that are in that domain of the snapshot, but there isn't that. There's also these incredibly carefully composed images. There's a range, I guess, and I today am obviously highlighting those ones that have this very precise composition. My favorite of these is this work. It's called Imagining Caravaggio from 2012. And here the text is carefully confined to the black briefs of the very beautiful portrait sitter. And obviously he's not sitting, he's lounging extremely seductively. And of course, for those of us art historians and artists, in the this young man reminds one of, or the composition certainly reminds us of, the Italian Renaissance painter Caravaggio. The text here, so there's this sort of sexiness, extraordinary languorousness about this young man, and then this sort of, I guess it is again sort of humorous way in which the briefs are used. And again, this precision, the way the text stays very neatly inside these briefs, sort of old-fashioned briefs, which indeed is mentioned in the text. So you have to go right up to this young man's genitals, or I guess, in order to read it. So it's sort of, if you think of how Renaissance paintings used exactly for the female nude, it used exactly that same hand gesture, drawing your attention to the genital region while also obscuring it. So again, even in the pose, there's a reference to the tradition of the nude. So the text reads, "We'd met before, and he had initiated our friendship on Facebook. I requested he bring a pair of plain underpants to the shoot as a way of preparing him for my intention to take partially naked photos, although I hadn't expected the underpants to be black or cut in the manner of old style Speedos. He was a photographic virgin, at first slightly intimidated by the camera, then becoming more relaxed. Turns out he was photogenic. When I look at the photos, I can imagine Caravaggio. And the flesh in this caramel tones is quite extraordinary. So he's highlighting youthful perfection by contrasting this golden flesh against this velvety black background, which indeed is highly reminiscent of the portraits of the Italian master. But obviously that velvety black background is slightly undercut by the black of the briefs and the way the briefs almost turn into like a blackboard. And it sort of voids that central area as well as drawing attention to it. So it's a very layered image, very layered portrait of this extraordinarily sexy young man. So not all of the men in Young's portraits conform to stereotypes of male beauty. The joint portrait of the middle-aged couple, Jeff and Joe, is an example of a broader conception of male body. So it's not, his oeuvre is not a narrow, only these exquisite bodies. These two tubby, heavy-set, would have a better way to put it, heavily tattooed men are shown amidst the clutter of their bedroom. The bedside table, I hope I'm not, I probably am obscuring the bedside table, but just to tell you, on the right-hand side of the image, there's a bedside table which is spilling over with books. So it's both men look out at the camera sort of unsmilingly. That's not quite right to say. The figure on the right, I guess, has beginnings of a smile. The figure on the left is unsmiling. Their gaze, though, despite that, is also welcoming. It's not a antagonistic gaze out towards us. And their conjoined bodies curve to form a horseshoe shape that opens out towards the viewer, sort of reinforcing that idea of us being funneled in to look at their bodies. While their bright tattoos clash with the bed sheets and the highly patterned wallpaper, they appear languidly sensual. Young's handwritten text, which you can see above the bedhead there, sort of in the center. Again, a quirky placement of the text relative to this incredibly busy scene overall. So this handwritten text sits unobtrusively, if you like, above the bedhead. It says, "I'd known them for years, photographing them around the traps, but never in their home. So it's a very interesting interior. So he's taken this image in their own environment, as opposed to some of the other images, with obviously his bed in the case of Joe, or a more studio environment in the case of the Imagining Caravaggio image. So the male body is shown in quite a diverse range of contexts. And in this instance, again, if you think of the image I started with, where the text was caressing the curve of these two beautiful young men who are deeply in love, here you have what is presented as a very long-term partnership. Again, this kind of a very intimate and engaging portrait of relationships, romance, and so forth. And it's interesting also that he's making the male body, even when it doesn't conform to stereotypes of beauty, sensual, languid, appealing. We're brought into the idea of a range of bodies that can be eroticized and viewed with pride. So the somewhat easy and matter-of-fact approach to gay identity in these images, which I've been looking at, contrasts with the artist's humor and hesitancy about his Chinese identity. Arguably, for William Yang, invisible sexual identity is easily presented, while the visible one of Chineseness is more troublesome. And perhaps what Young's inversion here of visibility and invisibility allows is a much more complicated picture of the intersecting components of contemporary identity. Intersectionality, which is now a sort of a key approach in feminism of thinking about the different things that add to oppression, whether it's race, gender orientation, etc. Intersectionality, in turn, needs to take into account the uneven ways in which these components sometimes preoccupy us and at other times warrant no concern at all. So it's a very layered approach to identity, where Chineseness, the visible component of identity, is slowly embraced, whereas gay identity, which is not in the domain of visibility in quite the same way, is very lovingly and matter-of-factly represented.